Hey everybody, as most of you know by now, I'm BJ. I'm the genealogy librarian at the Maine State Library, and I'm here in Maine where it's unusually warm today, so my brain has been half a step short of melting all day. So if I seem a little less or even more incoherent than normal, there's a reason. And tonight I'm going to talk about the censuses done from in the U.S. federal census from 1850 to 1880. And these are interesting because while they're less detailed than the ones we looked at last week in the 20th century, they do at least supposedly list everybody, rather than, as opposed to the ones we'll deal with next week that only listed the head of the household. So it's a step in the right direction compared to those. So first of all, as I'm sure most of you know, the 1890 census no longer exists. So we have this gap, and it's an unfortunate gap because it's a point in US history where people were moving around, and it would have been really nice to have the census for 1890, but we don't. So such is life, but we can still work with the other ones earlier. They have, they are a snapshot the same way the 20th century ones are. They're a little less detailed, but they also go back into a time period where most states were not requiring vital records, which means that you can sometimes pick up information that you can't get elsewhere. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a bit about things in general, and then we'll take a look at some examples. So let's see, I'm looking for one I want to show you because it's funny. There we go. So on these, you'll get the name of everybody, you'll get an age, you'll get occupations for the adults, which generally means anyone 15 and older. You'll get race, and there were specific categories of race. Let me find, no, Scout, down. Scout, I need my notes for this one, I promise. I'll pay attention to you in 45 minutes. So in 1850 and 60, there were 3 categories of race on the census. You had free whites, free black or mulatto, and those enslaved. And the slaves were put on a separate slave schedule. In 1870 and 80, the categories you could have for race were white, black, mulatto, Indian, and Chinese. Oh. So they were keeping track of it at that point, but there weren't that many categories. And Indian in that case was indeed what we would now call Native American. I will tell you my basic experience. I'm going to give you a handout in a few minutes. My basic experience is that you get a lot and lots of variation in how names are done. You get abbreviations, you get initials, you get nicknames, much more than later in the 20th century. And so you will one of the things I've put in the packet I'm going to give to you is an excerpt from a book where it goes through the names of the presidents and gives you different ways the names can be messed up. So, Drew Jackson instead of Andrew Jackson, or H.W. Harrison instead of William Henry Harrison, or Bill McKinley instead of William McKinley.
Wow.
And so it's a really good handy cheat sheet to think about ways the name you're looking for could have been butchered.
Can I
And
ask
believe
you
me,
a
they got
question
both.
about, I'm sorry, can I ask you a question about that? It seems like I keep hearing it from people I'm introducing to genealogy too. In that period, people have their first and middle name, and sometimes the middle name won't appear, but later in life they appear by the first and middle name reversed. So
Yep.
God help you if they never showed up with the middle name in the first place.
Right. Yeah. The whole idea of one person having a name that is their one official name used in all official contexts with one particular spelling is a 20th century invention. Okay.
So why did people reverse their names so often?
They like their middle name better. There were 17 Williams in town and there were only 2 Thomases, so they decided to go by Thomas. So I've got a quick PowerPoint to show you that goes through a little of this. So I'm going to share my screen. And let's do slideshow. So, I routinely say that these are genealogical gold mines, but they are also snapshots. And so you will, particularly in this era, I found cases where there were, kids born in 1871, died in 1877, and so they never appear on a census with their family. And it's only when I go look at cemetery and the grave markers, I realized there was another kid in the family. So, oh, wait a minute. So here's a good one. This is actually a state census, because in the 1870s and 80s, the federal government gave financial assistance to states who wanted to do a state census. And this is a case where sometimes people want to fill in all the boxes on the search page at Ancestry. And this is going to be a case where sometimes the less you put in, the better. So I was looking for John Lockwood, and I found somebody who turned out not to be the man I was looking for. But I thought it was interesting. He's on the census. And here he is, he's down here, and he's listed as J.H. Lockwood, and the census taker listed his occupation as Bible banger. Well, I was looking for a John Lockwood who was a farmer. And so this is a case where if I put in farmer under occupation, it would have bumped this down further in the results because this didn't match. Now, evidently, this Frank Wilkeson, who was the enumerator, had a bit of an attitude because he describes James Coleman as a blowhard and Job Law as a loafer.
That's funny.
So, so yeah, obviously, census takers were not asking for proof. They were just writing down what they were told. Or in this case, maybe a little commentary. We don't know who the informant was on these. It could easily be a neighbor. If you think about out in Kansas, census takers going around by horse, and if somebody's not home, but the neighbor can tell him who lives there, he's probably just going to write it down and not bother to come back. So that's something to keep in mind. And I've talked about this a little bit, but relationship issues. We all have them, right? The census has them as well. So here's this entry for an Alex Parody up in Fort Kent, and it lists him in a household with Joseph Parody, Sarah Parody, another Joseph, and then a bunch of other kids. This looks like a pretty typical late 19th century French Canadian family who happens to be living on the US side of the border. Barely. I mean, Fort Kent's not that far into the country. And it would be really tempting at this point, and they do it here, they put Sarah Parody as his mother. Well, let's take a look, so that's 1880. Let's take a look 10 years earlier, or no, sorry, this is the same one. So you have Joseph Parody, Sarah his wife, Joseph his son, and here's Alex his son, right? But let's look 10 years earlier. And here we have Joseph Parody with Helen Parody, Joseph Parody, and then all of the other kids' names are the same for those who were already born. So what do you think now about Sarah being his mother?
Probably not.
Probably not.
Yeah.
There's a really good chance that Helen died and the older Joseph remarried. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And you need to remember on all of these, the relationship is to the head of the household, not to the spouse of the head of the household.
Right. Right. Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
All right, so let me show you. Now, this is a slightly different example because it's one I like. It's looking in Scotland. And I had information, they had a child born in Edinburgh in 1855. And the marriage record said they were married in Dundee in the mid-1840s. And they'd had a couple children who'd already died. So I didn't know who was living at the time of the 1851 census. This information is from that 1855 birth record. And I couldn't find them. Now, as you can imagine, Callahan is a name that can be incredibly butchered. The variations I found, and I'm thinking, okay, Mary born in Ireland's not going to get me anywhere. But fortunately, doing the combination of Mary and Thomas living in Dundee, born in Ireland, brought up this example of Thomas Callican. And if we look, there he is with Thomas Callican, Maria Callican, and his son Thomas. And so this turns out I found other records. This is the right couple. But what this shows is at this point, you are going to want to sometimes, particularly if someone is not born in the area, so you can use their birthplace as a variable. You can sometimes use just first names without a last name. And this is really important. For example, if you have an Italian ancestor in 1880 in Boston with an Irish census taker.
If I can just say, as someone who studied Irish for 3 semesters, it depended a lot on who the census taker was, whether
Right,
if it's an Irish name, if it's an Irish census taker, you'll get the Irish spelling, and if it's an English census taker, you're going to get whatever spelling they can figure out.
right. And if you get an Irish census taker dealing with an Italian family, all bets are off. And so in this era where you have a lot of people who are not native English speakers flooding the cities of the Eastern Seaboard, you're going to have to be flexible. And that's why I showed this one, because this is a case where it's somebody Irish in Scotland. The accents aren't that different. And look how it gets spelled. And then the problem is when it's done that way, the various ways that these websites pick up variations in spelling don't necessarily pick this up. So that's the extent of the PowerPoint for today. So I'm going to switch to, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And go to, I'm going to show you some interesting ones. I cancel this. So here's the 1870 census. And one of the things I like is Ancestry does a fairly good job of trying to make sure the header is legible. If it's not, or if you don't want to have to scroll up and down on the page, if you Google the census year and blank census form, you can get, where's an example here? I had an example. You can actually get blank census forms to fill in. And let me stop sharing my screen for a minute to show you. So, you know, this is just an empty 1850 census form. And Ancestry has them, Family Search has them, bunches of other places have them. So if you want them to fill out or to just not have to scroll up and down the page to see what the columns were, you can do that. So here you get, you'll notice they don't have an address. In 1870 and 1880, you will sometimes get an address for cities, but this is out in the country. So all you get is the number of the house and the number of the family. And so this tells me that basically everybody here is pretty much living in a single family home, because it's the 205th house they visited and the 207th family. So you're not getting a lot of apartment buildings that this guy's gone, the enumerator's gone to. I like it when they do this, they have the last name and just draw a line saying it's the same name, because it makes it easier to skim.
Excuse me, BJ, are you sharing your screen right?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I should have gone back. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So anyway, so we have, we have at the top, they tell you what day they visited, because the census days, and where's my handout with that? I've got that listed somewhere here. In 1870, they were supposed to count the household as it was on the 1st of June. And the census, the enumerators had 5 months to finish the census. So as you can see, they've gotten around to this part of Washington Township in Missouri on the 29th of August. But they're supposed to ask about the household as it was on June 1st. Everyone with me on that? And so you will get, you will sometimes get people make mistakes because, you know, baby born in July gets listed. Somebody who died in the beginning of May gets listed when they shouldn't have been. Does that make sense to everybody? So pay attention. So if something's sometimes a little weird from or off from what you're expecting, it may be that they messed up either the informant or the census taker. One of the interesting things, works on farm and farmer are supposed to distinguish between, the farmer is the primary person. He's the one responsible for the farm. And you'll see farm laborer, you'll see farmhand, you'll see works on farm. All of those are subsidiary. They're not the person overall responsible for the farm. That's the person who's the farmer. And keeping house and being a housekeeper, where if you see someone that's listed keeping house, she's keeping her own household. A housekeeper is working for somebody else. Does that distinction make sense? And they were also supposed to, at this point, their profession is supposed to be whatever they made the most money from the previous year. So if they made $501 from being a carpenter and $499 from being a farmer, they're supposed to be listed as a carpenter, even if farming was really their occupation. So again, if you see one where it's off, where you're expecting farmer all of the time, and one of the censuses in this era says carpenter or something else, it may be that they had a bad year on the farm and made extra money somehow that overtook the farming as their primary source of income. And I pulled this one up because at the bottom it's kind of funny. So we have this family. We've got William Marlin, farmer. And there's this woman living with them. And the occupation given for her is sins with Marlin. So I'm thinking that the informant was probably the wife, and she just discovered that Elizabeth, who was their maid, was having an affair with William. I think. At least that's how I interpret that. But, you know, sins with Marlin. How's that for an occupation? And at this point, my occupation is takes the cat off the computer. And then you get an estimate of the value of their real estate and an estimate of their personal estate. So it's what they own in real estate and everything else. And sometimes it's worth looking. So for example, here's a farmer who doesn't own real estate. So he must be there's a good chance he's renting, which means that he probably doesn't have deeds in his name for you to find. Whereas somebody who has this farm with a higher amount than on the others on the page, that's not only are you going to find deeds, but you're more likely to find a probate file for him. And then it gives the state where they were born. And this looks like it's one where there's nobody who was born overseas. Nope, there wasn't. Because they did note that down at the bottom. And then they asked if parents were of foreign birth. They didn't ask where, just if the parents were of foreign birth. If born in the previous year, which month, and married in the previous year, which month. I've had people not read that and just see birth month and marriage month and then wonder why these are all empty. But it's only if that happened in the previous year. Does that distinction make sense? And you need to remember at this point, they're also doing the separate mortality schedule. So if somebody died in the year before the census, they're supposed to be listed on the separate schedule of everybody who died in the year before the census. And then you get whether they attended school. And this, for this year, they wanted, instead of saying yes to can read and write, it was a check mark if they could not. So see the cannot read, cannot write. And then you get whether somebody's deaf and dumb, blind, insane, or idiotic. You know, again, these are the beginnings along with the mortality schedule of early public health measures. Okay, you know, they were trying to figure out, they're beginning to want to figure out the population that needed extra care. And then this is interesting, at the end, they do ask, these are the men eligible to vote, and men who are not eligible to vote. Primarily because they served in the Civil War on the Confederate side and had not yet taken an oath of allegiance to the Union that restored their voting rights. So if I go, let's go to Alabama, and we'll choose a county at random and a township. Most of the men by this point would have, you'll see, you're getting people, they've taken the oath that was required to restore their voting rights. But you will see a few men who hadn't yet at this point. Okay. So let's take a look at an 1860. And which family was it I wanted on this page? Oh, this is interesting. This is in Ipswich, Massachusetts. And what they've done is, this is the House of Correction. It's the local jail. And in the column that was supposed to be whether somebody was deaf, dumb, blind, insane, idiotic, pauper, or convict, they actually put not only that somebody was a convict, but what they were convicted of. So you've got somebody disturbing the peace, assault, nuisance, adultery, larceny, drunkenness, vagabond. Can't read some of these. And then if you go further, next door was the insane asylum. And they put same thing, insane, and then what type of insanity it was. So, and a lot of these are cause unknown. And so this was a census taker going above and beyond what he was supposed to put in there. He was just supposed to put insane, and he actually detailed out what it was. So let's take a look. Here's another one where you have an interesting one. So this is out in Kansas, and it, again, you know that you're getting 89 houses, 94 families, so you're mostly getting single family homes here. You're getting, here's one that says House of ill something. So it's basically a brothel. And so instead of writing prostitute, they give the women occupations like squirms in the dark, does horizontal work, and so on. And you can see that, you know, what's interesting is you've got a couple, he's a farmer, she's keeping house. This is the farmer's property. And here's his, and you'll notice, I'm guessing that they're husband and wife, but it doesn't say. 1880 is the first year that they give those relationships to the head of the household. In 1850, 60, and 70, they don't. So this could be his sister or a cousin. But she's obviously doing fairly well with being a madam. Well, George is a farmer. So, and the other thing to note here is this is a page where you do get some people. Here you see 3 people born in Scotland. And you will see down here, they have filled out, there were 10 dwellings, 10 families, 10 white males, and then white females, colored males and females, and foreign born, and then if there was anybody blind. And this is a running total, or this is a total for the page of the real property and personal property. And then they were supposed to tally these columns as well. And so I'm guessing that these two are husband and wife, because you'll see that they give the same month for having been married in the previous year. So I'm guessing that means that they are husband and wife and not siblings or something like that, whose spouses just happen to both be away. The other thing to notice, and let's see, I forget how they handle it here. New York. So this is New York City. And if you look here, you will see it says Ward 1, District 1, Ward 1, District 1, second enumeration. And basically what happened for several cities, including New York City in 1870, is that the first enumeration was so bad that they went back and did a second one. And the downside is there's almost, in many places, there's little to no correlation between the two. Partly people moved, partly the first one was done so badly that it's hard to correlate. I have not worked with it extensively, but I know people who have, and it's a real, you want to see if you can find your people in both. If you're looking at one of the cities, I want to say it was New York. It was New York and St. Louis and a couple others where they went back and did it a second time because the first version had been so badly done. So that's just something to put on your radar. As if you're not finding somebody, it may not be you. It may be that the first enumeration was so bad. So I put a packet into, let me stop sharing for a minute. I put a packet into the chat called Census Reference. And I want to tell you what's in it. The first one, the first 2 pages are looking at a family from 1840 through to 1900, and a little bit of how they went through and found the family and figured out various things from the data. You know, when the family moved from Alabama to Georgia and so on, from what's in the census. and how in some censuses you get initials, and in some you get full names, and so on. So I just thought it was an interesting look at how they looked at figuring out that family. And I often do this kind of chart with a family. Let me share my screen while I'm talking. Here we go. So there's a bit of the analysis. Here's the chart. And as you can see, they followed the family through and shown you some things. The next page is interesting because it lumps things by type of information and which years they asked it. So you can sort of at a glance see that, you know, obviously the only year they asked about a radio was 1930. How many children a woman had and how many were still living, they asked from 1890 to 1910. So it's just a slightly different way of looking at the data. This one didn't come out well. I'll try to get a better one for you, but it's a worksheet. Then these next two pages, as I said, are the lots of different ways that you could mess up somebody's name. So things like, you know, maybe one year when he was a kid, Rutherford behaved, you know, maybe his family called him Ford instead of Rutherford. And so he ends up on the census as Ford Hayes. Don't know if it ever happened, but, you know, it could have. Here's the data on what race was asked. And as you can see, many of these, you know, they're distinguishing here with Indian and Hindu, which is not anywhere near what we do. And you can tell some indication of what groups were here and they were the Census Bureau was interested in. Here's one with the census day, the most common names in two different census years that really aren't that different. How many people were counted? This is an interesting little thing of where the center of the US population was, and it gradually moves west, starting in Maryland and out through Virginia and Ohio and eventually to Missouri. And if you print this off, that will be an easier thing to see. And then this is doing the census information. Here you have the type of information, and here you have the year. And you can see some years were more detail-oriented than others. And that continues on the next page. The other thing I'm going to put in the chat, let me stop screen sharing, is just for fun. I'm not going to check up on you or anything with this. But if you want to play around with finding somebody on the census, I've done up a little, where is it? Worksheet. Come on, open up so I can share you. Come on. For some reason, it's not wanting to open. Because that's the way today's gone. Okay, here we go. So let me share my screen again. And I've done 2 of these, one for Wyatt Earp and one for Franklin Roosevelt. His are a little later, but these are a good way to do some playing around. Wyatt Earp is interesting. If you do this, don't expect to only find him in Illinois and Arizona. Okay? And he's not always a farmer. But I just figured if next week I'll have this with the answers. So if you decide to do it, you can double check yourself. But it's a way to look at some of the ways data varies and people aren't necessarily where you expect them to be. The other fun one to do that takes you across 3 countries, Scotland, Canada, and the US, if you want to challenge, is Alexander Graham Bell. It's an interesting challenge for finding on the census. But that's, you know, as I said, I'm not going to like ask if you've done it or anything, but I just wanted to give you a bit of a challenge if you wanted it. So, you know, in this era, basically what you're seeing on the census is, you know, you're getting everybody who's free in a way you won't with what we look at next week, but you're also not getting quite the depth of detail that you were getting in the 20th century returns we looked at last week. So it is really kind of a transitional period. The other thing I want to mention is in some ways, at least as much as with the early 20th century returns, the Eastern European countries, Central and Eastern European countries, will vary greatly. They had lists of them for the census takers, but the census takers may or may not have paid any attention to the approved list of countries. I've noticed that, like with those things with the jail putting in what they were in for, you do get places where the census takers gone above and beyond what they were asked to put in. I've seen other cases where they've put in relationships, even though there was not really a space for it. They, you know, at least in the children's column for occupation, they put son or daughter. So there are things like that that are worth noting if the enumerator did. The thing I found a lot of people do with these is because they can be sometimes a little harder to find people in, because so many name variations, people were moving around, it's harder to figure out, is this exactly who I need it to be, or I'm hoping it is. I have worked with a lot of people who find somebody in 1880 and they find them in 1860, and then they give up on ever finding them on any other pre-1900 census. And I can say pretty clearly that almost every time I've had that happen with somebody, if we've gone back and dug around and found their ancestor in the other censuses, we found something that either completely broke down a supposed brick wall or gave a piece of information that led to something that led to breaking down the supposed brick wall. For example, on one of these, it was in 1870, the woman I was working with hadn't bothered to look. You know, she looked once, the person didn't come up on the first, just one round of putting the name in the boxes at Ancestry. And it turned out we found him just over the border into another state. She'd ruled him out. We looked at it, realized the kids are all the right ages and had been born in the right places. And it turned out that he'd been renting when she found him in later censuses, and he owned land in that census. And when she then went and found the deed, which gave the town the family had come from was Virginia or North Carolina, where there weren't good records. But once she had the town, she was able to find records that worked by looking for other people with that surname in that town. So I encourage you, if you have gaps like that, if you've found 2 or 3 of these and you haven't found somebody on the others, go look for them. You're likely to find something. I've had cases where it was someone didn't know the wife's maiden name, and it turns out the one they hadn't looked at was where her brother was living with them. And that right there is like 90% of a chance that it's the right last name for her maiden name. I mean, there may be some step and half siblings where it wouldn't be. But, she'd spent almost 10 years looking for the wife's maiden name and hadn't bothered to look at the one census, which it turned out was where the brother was living with them, with the wife's maiden name as his surname. So in a couple weeks, I'm going to do one of these on how to find the people that seem to have dropped out of nowhere and seem to have avoided the census taker every time, because there are some tricks to finding people when you can't, like I did with that Callahan family and just looked at the first names. Obviously, if you're looking for Mary born in Ireland in 1860 in Boston, you need more than that. But if you're looking for somebody born in Italy, living on the coast of Maine with an unusual first name, but he's here in 1880 because there's work in the quarry, that might well be a good strategy. Make sense to everybody? Any questions at this point?
I have one.
Yes.
Okay, Catherine first.
Okay.
Thank you. I've noticed in looking at my people that it can also be fun to look at the non-population schedules.
I've done a whole separate one on that.
This.
But
Okay,
yes.
I'll wait. Thank you. What I'm
They
curious
are.
about.
The other thing is, in addition to the non-population schedules, look at neighbors, especially if you're looking at people who lived in the East and moved out West. There's a good chance that there are people near them who are came from the same area they came from.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're not finding something, you may find them by looking at their neighbors.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I am putting the non-population schedule program YouTube into the chat box.
Thank you.
So anyone who missed that, feel free to go back and watch. And my other comment is, if you do watch things at YouTube and like them, right under the, I'll show you, I'll go to one of these and, oh, let's go here. I'll pull that one up and let me share my screen. And this is one of those things I really don't care, but I'll tell you why it helps. See here where there's the up and down thumb? When you start doing things like doing an up thumb or making a comment, the more people do that, the higher the videos will be in the search results if somebody looks for, say, something on the census. And so then more people will see it. And that's helpful as more people watch it. It helps me convince the higher ups at the library that this is worth doing. So feel free to just hit the like or leave a comment. Because that will help with the, I really don't care. I know you guys are liking them, but that's just the way the system works, is it factors that into its search results. Okay, so we had another question.
Yeah, I was wondering if you have any tips. I have a person who disappeared off the map, a family who disappeared off the map, and looking back through all the records and newspaper accounts, which were really quite interesting, he stopped supporting her. He was having drunken interactions that involved jail. He kind of disappeared for a few years. She sued for divorce. He couldn't be found. He was turning up in the census as a butler, which I don't know what that really meant. And then she and her daughters disappear without any trace. And I'm quite certain that she must have changed her name.
She may well have remarried.
No, I'm really quite certain not. I've looked so hard for marriage records. And
So what era is this? When are we talking about?
1870s to between 1868 and 1870 and 1875.
Okay, see, that's still in the era where there are a lot of states that are not keeping vital records.
Cleveland was doing a pretty good job.
Okay, but yeah, she may have moved away.
I've looked for her everywhere. Really, she had this amazing name, which is not coming to mind. It was like Pilphonia. I mean, it was just.
Yeah, but yeah, she may well have. She may be there with initials and a butchered last name. If you haven't looked for the daughters directly, I would.
Yeah, I've looked for the whole family.
Yeah, one or more of the daughters may have died. When a daughter got old enough, she may have married, and the mother's living with them, and it got messed up. You have to remember one of the big things on all of this is we don't know who the informant was. And they let anybody be. Neighbors could be the informant, the 11-year-old girl who's home watching over her 3 younger siblings while the mother works at the cotton factory.
Well, she actually owned and ran her own business, and the whole business seemed to have pulled up roots. It was stopped advertising in the newspaper. She was gone.
Yeah, so I would do some looking. Yeah, that's interesting. There's a good chance they moved somewhere.
Yeah.
What type of business was it?
She was apparently a high-end seamstress and is it milliner that's the hats?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would do some looking in city directories in other cities.
Yeah.
And see if she pops up there.
Milliners aren't probably likely to show up in the Wild West.
Well, you never know.
Well, there's that.
And by that point, you're getting some pretty big cities out west. You're getting both Midwestern cities, Chicago, St. Louis, and so on. And you're beginning to get San Francisco and places like that, Denver. And
Good point.
she may well have
Ohio
gone out
cities.
She may
Yeah.
well have gone out to one of those to find a husband. The male-female ratio in some of those cities like Denver was exceedingly favorable for women wanting to remarry, especially if she wanted to marry someone who didn't ask too many questions about her previous husband.
Mm, good point. Yeah,
Um,
I thought it was
Chicago, though.
interesting enough to begin with that she filed for divorce.
Yeah. Oh, no, that's not at all unusual.
Even in 1870?
Oh, no, not at all.
Huh.
I mean, it wasn't as common as it is today, but trust me, it was not something that never happened either.
Yeah.
I just watched a webinar about a woman from the 1860s to 1900 who'd been married 6 times, and it was only one of them she outlived. The other 5 were either divorces or desertions where she didn't get around to divorcing him.
Mm.
So that's just something that, yeah, it's going to be a bit of a, I would look and see if you can find, the other thing to do is search for obituaries for her daughters,
Yeah.
because there may be some indication of where the daughters married their husbands, and that may lead you to where they ended up.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah, so I'd look for the daughters, if you have their approximate birth year in place and their first names, if they're not too outrageously common, I would look in 1880 and 1900 and see if you can find them.
Yeah, I've tried that, but if they married a Smith, then all bets are off.
Right. But the other thing you can do, email me the details, and I'll see if I'll poke around a bit. I'm always looking for interesting problems.
Okay.
And sometimes just, send me essentially a family group sheet. And I can take 15 or 20 minutes to poke around and see. And that goes for all of you. If you're just I need a second pair of eyes, I'll just warn you, my turnaround time these days is a good week. Everybody's sending me stuff, which is fine. I'm not complaining, but it means that my mailbox is often full. So